back to the drama in Emmerdale this evening at 7. You're watching STV this Monday afternoon, where we're back to the bargain hunting in half an hour. First at 1:30, the lunchtime news and weather.
Behind the tragic plight of those risking their lives to flee Afghanistan. These are the images the West was desperate to avoid. Thousands of Afghans throwing themselves to get on planes evacuating Westerners from Kabul.
When we flew into Kabul yesterday morning, Afghanistan was still a Western-friendly democratic republic. Today, it's an Islamic emirate.
We speak to the UN in the Afghan capital about the humanitarian situation facing 40 million Afghans left under Taliban rule.
It is a grim picture. We have got around 400,000 people, half of whom are children, who have been forced from their homes in the last few weeks.
Also this lunchtime, new COVID rules mean the double jab will no longer need to isolate, and a moment to remember as Plymouth falls silent for the 5 victims shot dead in the city.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Rageh Omaar.
Good afternoon. There have been chaotic scenes in Kabul as thousands of Afghans attempt to flee the country after the Taliban took control. At the city's airport, people have been filmed rushing onto the airfield and attempting to climb onto planes, some as they were taxiing to take off. Afghanistan's Western-backed government collapsed yesterday after the Taliban's lightning-fast advance across the country. This lunchtime, the Prime Minister is holding meetings in Downing Street as efforts continue to bring home British nationals in the country. More on that in a moment. But first, Martha Fairley on the situation in Kabul.
They are desperate, fearful, and will do anything to get out of Afghanistan. As an American military cargo plane taxis along the runway, crowds cling to the fuselage in a high-stakes bid to escape. At Kabul airport this morning, there's been chaos and confusion. People clambering onto the passenger boarding bridge and surrounding planes on the tarmac, even though most commercial flights have now been suspended. And while everyone here is trying to get out, many who've chosen to stay are still worried what might happen under the return of the Taliban and their strict interpretation of Sharia law.
In Herat, we saw girls were not allowed to go to university. In Kandahar, we saw women were asked to go back home when they were working in the bank. So these are a few things that makes me worried about the future of Afghan women. It's not that what the people did, but it's the Afghan women and their sacrifices. What about them?
Outside the airport, there is the sound of gunfire as armoured vehicles manoeuvre nearby, and an already nervous crowd runs for cover. Taliban fighters have taken over the security checkpoints around Kabul, trying to project calm over Afghanistan's capital and a population wearied by war. The country's president, Ashraf Ghani, has fled, but as yet no new leader has been declared. This man, Mullah Baradar, is likely to take his place, the senior Taliban figure congratulating the people of Afghanistan for their victory in a video released last night. The Taliban say they will ensure the interests of the people, but their fighters are now patrolling a deserted green zone, once filled with embassies and diplomats. And the international community is evacuating, not knowing what will happen next to the country they are quitting. Martha Fairley, ITV News.
Well, our senior international correspondent John Irvine is in Kabul, and he sent this report from the Afghan capital a little earlier.
When we flew into Kabul yesterday morning, Afghanistan was still a Western-friendly democratic republic. Today, it's an Islamic emirate. A few hours ago, we spoke to one of the new rulers in this city, a senior Taliban commander who with his men took over a large UN compound just yesterday. He said he claimed they'd received a warm welcome from Kabul residents. When I suggested that the dreadful scenes at Kabul airport of people trying to flee suggested that many Afghans are absolutely terrified of the Taliban, he responded by saying that that was the fault of foreign invaders who he claimed had pumped out anti-Taliban propaganda for the last 20 years. I asked this Taliban commander about the future for Afghans who'd worked with the British, the Americans and others, the Afghans who we've seen trying to clamber on those planes. He appealed to those people not to try to flee, but to stay here. He said that when they were standing shoulder to shoulder with foreigners, they were the Taliban's enemy, but that now that, quote, the infidels had betrayed those Afghans, they were brothers who would be forgiven. The scenes at Kabul airport suggest that many Afghans simply don't believe Taliban reassurances and would rather take their chances clinging to the undercarriage of a US transport than stay here. Kabul itself is in a strange place. There's something of a vacuum. It's far from totally secure. And there are relatively few Taliban here at the minute. There's a big convoy, we believe, of around 10,000 fighters heading this way on the main road from Kandahar. People here are frightened. What's very noticeable still is the absence of women on the streets. Those that you do see are wearing full burqas or full facial veils. There is a fear here of the return of female servitude under the Taliban. The autumn is approaching, and in Afghanistan the clocks are about to go back, but I'm afraid it'll be more than by 1 hour.
Our correspondent John Irvine there in Kabul, and I'm joined here in the studio by our correspondent Dan Rivers to talk much more about the international context of what's happening and befallen Afghanistan and where this leaves the notion of the West's position in the world and who are the winners and the losers, quite aside from the people in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, people are equating this to the sort of, fall of the Shah in Iran in 1979 or the fall of Saigon. I mean, it seems clear that American influence in Afghanistan has evaporated almost sort of overnight. I mean, this has been precipitous that has caught, not only the UK government off guard, apparently, but also the American administration as well. The rapid advance of the Taliban to take over the capital. The question now is clearly who benefits and who will the Taliban deal with. China pointedly has kept its embassy open. China's foreign minister has already held a meeting with the Taliban leader. So it seems they clearly are eyeing the interests in Afghanistan there. Russia is keeping its embassy open as well. But clearly American and British interests are suddenly on the wane. And there are a lot of questions about how this happened so precipitously. In some reports suggesting that the Afghan National Army only actually had a sixth of its strength that it had on paper.
Okay, Dan, thank you very much indeed. As we were hearing there, the speed of the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan has taken many in the West by complete surprise, not least the governments in Washington and here in the UK. It's forced ministers here to speed up efforts to rescue British nationals and those who supported the UK army during their 20 years in the country and now who fear for their lives. Boris Johnson is this lunchtime holding meetings to discuss the issue, and here's our political correspondent Carl Dinnan.
The astonishingly swift collapse of the Afghan regime in the face of the Taliban has left Western governments scrambling to catch up with events. Overnight, the government here swiftly made it easier for Afghans who've worked alongside British forces to get out.
People that have passed our vetting but don't have an Afghan passport will still be allowed to come through the process. And the last Afghan government, the one that disappeared yesterday, was insisting they had a passport. As long as we know who they are and we've done the checks, we'll suspend that as well and get people out. But there are still people who I'm afraid will not be able to get to Kabul and will just not be able to get out at this time.
A deployment of troops from 16 Air Assault Brigade had barely made it onto the ground by the time Kabul had fallen. They are there to secure the airport.
G-man, as you can see here.
But British forces spent 20 years trying to secure Afghanistan, building up Afghan forces alongside the US and other allies. Yet all that training, all that equipment seemed next to useless.
We're seeing before our very eyes the unravelling of 20 years of progress and of huge sacrifice. And I appreciate that the decision to withdraw was not the government's decision alone, but I want the Prime Minister to step up to the plate, show some leadership and some urgency.
Although what government can do here is limited. The Cobra Committee is meeting this afternoon. Parliament is being recalled on Wednesday. But it's too late to stop the Taliban. All that's left is mitigation and recrimination.
And this is now a humiliating strategic defeat for the West. We should, hang our heads in shame, given where Afghanistan is now sliding towards, which inevitably is a civil war.
But for now, the Taliban are the de facto regime in Afghanistan. The rest of the world can only wonder if they will honour their commitments to women's rights, whether Afghanistan will again become a haven for international terror, and what anyone else can do about it. Carl Dinnan, ITV News, Westminster.
Well, just before we came on air, I spoke to Sam Mort from UNICEF, who is in Kabul, and I started by asking, given the chaos in Kabul, what the humanitarian picture was like in the country.
It is a grim picture. We have got around 400,000 people, half of whom are children, who have been forced from their homes in the last few weeks. The first week at the beginning of the crisis, we saw more violence, we saw more killings of children and more injuries. Now we're seeing people coming to camps for internally displaced people, where we need to meet their needs. We need to give them medical care, we need to give them water and sanitation, we need to give the children psychosocial support because they've seen so many awful atrocities committed against those they love.
And are you able to do that, though? Are you able to give that help, given the circumstances under Taliban rule? Are you able to give that to those desperately needed?
We had been right up until Sunday. Now, although we have presence across the whole country, the Taliban has asked us to pause momentarily so that they can talk to their rank and file and explain that UNICEF is neutral and a humanitarian agency so that they can secure safe passage for our staff to deliver the life-saving
But this points to a sense of total confusion in Western policy. On the one hand, you've got governments like the UK and other international powers saying we must isolate the Taliban. But what do aid workers do like you who are forced to work with them?
For UNICEF, our first and only priority is the well-being of women and children. And we don't get involved in the politics. The Taliban understands that. It is standard practice for UNICEF all over the world to work with all parties to conflict in the interests of children's welfare. We have worked with the Taliban for a long time in Afghanistan, and they have asked us to stay. And they've asked for a couple of days just to let the dust settle, to get their messaging out to all their people, and then we fully expect to resume our life-saving programs.
And what are your bosses telling you about the need to stay, and will you and your colleagues stay?
It is our intention to stay and deliver. We've given that assurance to the women and children of Afghanistan. Of course, if it ever gets too dangerous, we will temporarily relocate our staff. But UNICEF has 75 years of experience in working in such circumstances. So our intention is to stay and help the women and children.
Sam, thank you very much indeed. Good luck. Godspeed, and thank you very much for your time, and stay safe. Thank you. Sam Mort from UNICEF speaking to me a little earlier. On to today's other news and changes to self-isolation rules in England and Northern Ireland. From today, anyone who has had both of their COVID vaccinations or is under the age of 18 will no longer need to self-isolate if they come into contact with someone who has tested positive. Instead, they'll be advised to get a PCR test, too, if you live in Northern Ireland, and will only need to self-isolate if you develop symptoms or test positive. Similar rules are already in place in Wales and Scotland. And to discuss this, I'm joined by Professor Linda Bald from the University of Edinburgh. Professor, do you think now is the right time to make this change?
This is something we've seen happening in a number of other countries as well. You know, the commitment by the UK government to people here was that come forward for your vaccines, and that is a key route out of the pandemic alongside maintaining a public health infrastructure. It is controversial and it's not without risk. We're hovering at anywhere between 25 and 30,000 cases a day, people with symptoms. So to say that you don't have to self-isolate, I think is a big shift. But we can't continually have thousands of people who are not necessarily positive, not engaging with education or work for the foreseeable future. So I think it's a reasonable step, but I must emphasize the importance of coming forward for a PCR test if you're a close contact. I don't think that's clear enough in the government guidance.
Well, given the impact that it could have on the situation with, as you say, 30,000 cases a day, that is kind of shifting the responsibility onto the public as opposed to the government giving some kind of clear guidelines if it could still have an impact.
That's correct. And as we are at this stage in the pandemic, Rageh, where we've seen, the legal restrictions lifted, but government trying to rely much more on our behaviour, it is challenging. And of course, you'll have groups who will say, well, I'm not going to bother with that. And then others who are very anxious and concerned will, of course, wish to still engage. But the public health message to do that, the other behavioural message is that if you're a close contact, particularly actually if somebody in the same household, all my colleagues would say, be very careful, wear a face covering, distance from others, even if you're going back outside, away from the person who's tested positive in your household.
What do we do about continuing the rollout to those aged 16 and 17, especially with, schools are getting underway in Scotland today, I believe, seems incredibly early, and only a few weeks in the rest of the country. How important is that, do you think, to keep the lid on this?
It is. Well, we've got over 70% now, almost 75 of 18 to 29-year-olds who've had a first dose, about 40% in Scotland of 16 and 17-year-olds already with a first dose. So let's be positive about the uptake, but still much further to go. So for those groups in particular, convenience, vaccine drop-in centres near where they are, good communication, and really just emphasising the importance of it. So it's a key part of the picture, but it's an evergreen offer for the vaccines. For anyone who's not yet had one, they can come forward that is eligible, and I hope that people will continue to do so.
And older children will be told to wear masks. How much of a difference do you think that will make in all of this?
Well, it's tricky, isn't it, Rageh? Looking across the UK, different guidelines in education. In Scotland, the plan is face coverings in secondary schools, I believe in Northern Ireland as well, for the first 6 weeks or so of term. Then it will be reviewed. For me in schools, I think ventilation is going to be a key component, and that's something still not being given enough attention. But fingers crossed for a good return to the classroom. It's really important for our children and young people that they can do that this summer and autumn.
It certainly does. Professor Linda Bald at the University of Edinburgh, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And we've put together a guide with all the changes taking place today. That's on our website, itv.com/news. In Haiti, rescuers continue to search for survivors after an earthquake struck over the weekend. Buildings were flattened when the 7.2 magnitude earthquake hit the Caribbean island on Saturday. Officials say the death toll is now up to almost 1,300, with many more missing. Officials in Tokyo have confirmed there will be no spectators at the Paralympic Games, which begin next week. Japan has been struggling with the high COVID infection rates, which prevented fans going to the Olympics. And here, a decision will be made this afternoon on whether to halt the killing of Geronimo, the alpaca. The government had ordered the animal to be put down twice after twice testing positive for bovine TB, but a judge will today rule on whether the case will be heard in court or if the killing can go ahead. A minute's silence has been held across the UK to remember the 5 people killed in the shooting in Plymouth on Friday. Hundreds gathered in the city itself to mourn and reflect on last Thursday's devastating effects. I should have said Thursday, sorry. Our reporter Bob Cruz is in Plymouth this lunchtime, a day for the people of the city to remember those killed.
Rageh, there's a sombre, reflective mood across Plymouth today, a sense that people are still trying to process in their minds the terrible sense of loss here. People are still arriving here at Biddick Drive to lay flowers in memory of the 5 people who were shot dead here on Thursday evening. And earlier today at 11 o'clock this morning, people stopped what they were doing to observe a minute's silence. They observe that silence not just here in the community of Keyham, but also on the Hoe, next to Plymouth's famous Smeaton's Tower lighthouse, and in the city centre itself, where city leaders stood with community leaders to pay tribute to the way that the city of Plymouth has come together to support each other through this tragedy.
We grieve because we love. Grief is love. We are in shock, feel guilty and angry about the events surrounding the deaths of our beloved community members, because we love. And it is that love and energy that we can now use to bring about change. As a community, we will look to restore and rebuild together. Collectively, we will support each other and with help bring back a community that we want our children to inherit.
In the wake of what the gunman Jake Davison did here last week, the government has said that it will now look at the way that gun licences are awarded. There will be changes to the way decisions are made, and that will include looking at people's social media accounts when police forces are making decisions over who's applied for a gun licence, and also to look urgently into their own practices, that's police forces right across the country, and whether they need to look again at some of those gun licences that have already been awarded.
OK, Bob Cruz in Plymouth, thank you very much indeed. A reminder of our main stories this lunchtime. There have been chaotic scenes in Kabul as thousands of Afghans attempt to flee the country after the Taliban took control. At the city's airport, people have been attempting to climb onto planes. Boris Johnson is holding meetings in Downing Street as efforts continue to bring home British nationals in the country. And changes to self-isolation rules in England and Northern Ireland have come into force today. Anyone who has had both of their COVID vaccinations or is under the age of 18 will no longer need to self-isolate if they come into contact with someone who has tested positive. And that's it this lunchtime. Charlene will be here with the evening news at 6:30. That's the news where you are follows next after the national weather. Thank you.